All right. Hello there, it's Shiana Reams, and this is the very first, the introductory video wherein we have guests to talk about their work, other Macedonians who are my colleagues and friends. And I'm starting out with kind of my partner in crime, so to speak, Graham Wrightson. We just put out a book. It just came out, I just saw today that the book has its own page at Peters, so I'm going to share that and let everyone see it. Okay, if I can find it, there it is. Okay. So this is fresh off the press. Macedonia's influences, narratives in politics and war, in honor of Edward M. Anson, who's another friend and colleague. A very good, I think, and maybe I'm biased, but I think a very good collection of articles on both warfare and politics, which are the two things that Ed himself has published on extensively. And there was also just this past September a conference which Graham was kind of in charge of that had not just the folks who contributed to the Festschrift, but one of these periodic quasi-biennial Alexander the Great conferences. So we had that as well, kind of to honor Ed as a guest speaker. So it's out from Peters. I know it's got awful expensive because it's one of these academic publishers. But if you have an interest in it, you can ask a library to order it, particularly university libraries, and then give it a couple of months and you can ask for it on interlibrary loan, which is the friend of anyone interested in academics, because almost never do libraries have all the things that we want. And so we get a lot of things from interlibrary loan. With that said, I am going to again introduce my friend Dr. Graham Wrightson. He is at South Dakota State University. And I'm going to open the questions with how did a nice Welsh boy end up teaching ancient history there?
Yes, thanks, Gianna. It's a pleasure to be the honorary opening act of the whole scenario. Yeah, I did my undergrad in Cambridge and then didn't want to stop being a student and get a real job, so I did a master's, and the only place that would take me was in Canada. So I ended up there working with Waldemar Heckel, who we all know well, and then I
They
did my
might not, so tell them who Valdemar is.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
Waldemar Heckel is one of the best known scholars throughout the world on the warfare of Alexander the Great, but in particular, he does prosopography, which, to those of you who don't know, is from the Greek word face and writing. So it's like the study of people in the ancient world. So he's written a couple of who's who's in the world of Alexander and the Successors, which are invaluable for collections of information of
Mhm.
notifications of individuals where they appear in sources and stuff.
Keep talking and I'll grab
Um,
mine.
so I went to work with him. I chose that place because I just decided to apply to the universities that I'd used books for my undergraduate dissertation. And so it happened to be Waldemar was one of the few places that had master's programs that didn't require me to take the GRE in America. And so I ended up in Canada. They thankfully were happy for me to come and paid for me to study. So I went there for my master's and then was supposed to do my PhD back in Exeter with another Alexandrian, Dan Ogden, and Stephen Mitchell.
Okay.
I didn't get the money for that. So I took a year off and then went back to Canada to work with Waldemar again. He sort of begged me to come back. And that's how I got in with the whole Sarissa stuff that we're going to talk about today, because he had a master student at that time who had created one and wanted to do more with it. And so he persuaded me to come back and take part of that research project that we did when we got back there. So then I did my PhD there, and then, as usual, just applied for jobs all around the world when I was finishing. And the only one I got an offer for was South Dakota. So that's where
Which
I ended
is
up.
Which is unfortunately for those of you who are interested in doing grad school in classics, the job market is ever tighter. Yeah, so we just apply it and pray that we get an offer. And we will go. People ask me, "How did you end up in Omaha?" And it's like they gave me a job.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
It's the same thing. But I would say to those doing grad school, like you can still make yourself more employable than others as a graduate student by teaching as much as you can. And I did some adult education classes on top of my load that I was paid for to do, which involved teaching medieval history, which in a classics department I couldn't normally teach. So I proposed them to the adult education department and they let me teach them. And knowing that most US institutions don't, you get a position as an ancient and medieval historian.
Mhm.
I needed to show that I could teach both. So that worked out well in that context because there's an ever dwindling number of classics only positions. So you have to open yourself out to community colleges and others where you have to teach a whole array of different classes. So publish stuff while you're in your PhD and teach as much as you can to show you can do it. And then you'll hopefully be the top group get jobs straight out of dissertation usually, or close by anyway, within a few years. So you want to make sure you're in that group, and then your chances are higher than others. So I encourage people to go still. Like obviously, some people get the jobs. Just make sure that you're one of the people who does. That's the only advice you can take, I guess.
Yeah, keep at it. Be stubborn. Um,
Yes, exactly.
all right, so a fun detail is you have a background in theater and you just got off, in fact, doing a show. Um, do you think that might have affected your interest in experimental archaeology? Or was it just Valdemar saying, Graham, come back and help with this?
Um, well, I grew up going to British castles and stuff where they had reenactment displays and things. So I've always had an affinity for reenactment types of things. I never really see the theater as helping with the history side of things. I see that helping with, lecturing and being in front of a
Mhm.
classroom and giving presentations. Like I don't have the same worry that other people do about presenting in class. And I'm so used to just standing up there and talking about whatever it is that it doesn't matter to me. But in terms of experimental history, I don't see the necessarily the connection with that. I had no intention of doing it until I got to do my PhD. I was gonna talk about write on tactical manuals and the intricacies of the hierarchy of armies, which is what I also work on. But then Waldemar, as I said, had this project that he was just getting off the ground. And so I jumped on board with that and then found it was enlightening, actually, rather than sort of doing the acting side, but seeing how the getting involved with the reenactment can help you understand the history more. And that's why there's so many reenactment groups all around the world doing
Mhm.
their different
Mhm.
periods of history. And we historians often give them a hard time for just playing dress up and stuff, right? But a lot of you have to have a lot of knowledge. You gain a lot of knowledge of the period from doing these reenactment stuff that you wouldn't otherwise pick up when it comes to weapons or tactics or even cloth making or understanding different aspects of the stuff you're using in experimental archaeology. A lot of it you can only understand by doing it because it's not written about in the sources, right? Even the archaeology can only tell you a certain amount of how these things were
Yeah.
used. It's only when you actually attempt to replicate stuff that you understand that. And that's why the science of experimental archaeology has taken off over the last 10 years or so. So I wouldn't say it was the acting side. Obviously, it doesn't confident and being in front of people and stuff, but it's more if you do sort of play dress up or you enjoy going to, see knights jousting and all that different stuff. That's what I grew up with. That's what made me want to get weapons in my hand and stuff.
And do it yourself. Now, all
Yeah.
right. So, for the audience who are not familiar with the experimental archaeology, experimental history, and you alluded to this, that it does sometimes, there are historians out there who kind of poo-poo it and laugh at it and say, why are you wasting your time with this? And you've kind of walked around it as benefiting historical inquiry. Um, Can you think of some, first explain what it is for the folks listening. And second, can you pick out a couple of maybe specific things that you learned from doing this? And then you just can kind of segue maybe into your Sarissa project from that.
Yeah, so experimental archaeology is basically taking some item or something from the past that we know existed, but we don't really know how it was used or how it functioned or what its significance was, and then recreating as close to an exact replica as you can, and learning through the process of that what that entails, and then also once you get the finished project, learning what you can about how it is used and how it can maybe answer questions when we see this item, whatever it might be, in the sparse records that we have, especially in ancient history. So people have reconstructed catapults based on minimal designs in old manuals, to see how you can do that and whether they use nails, metal nails or wooden nails, and types of knots that you have to make that they don't tell you about and stuff for the string, all sorts of different things. People have, in different periods too, I remember there was a study of Viking women's clothes, and people wondered why there were specific buttons on women's clothes in certain places than others until they put them on. They realized actually it was for breastfeeding, that you have actual easy access for that context. People didn't realize that before, apparently. So that's one in that side. There's all sorts of other examples throughout periods, and not just ancient and medieval history, but in modern history too. Sort of understanding what these things are for, you can only get to grips with when you actually have them, and
Mhm.
learn when
Mhm.
you're on the job. So that's what a lot of reenactment people do, whether it's these sort of less historically connected and more about the fun side of reenacting, or whether it's actually recreating real
Mhm.
history side of things. It's the practical aspects that don't appear in the writing usually, in the writings or even in the artifacts themselves, telling you about these things. Some of them you can look at and you don't know what they're for until you actually attempt it. So that's basically what the science of experimental archaeology is, as opposed to there's two different versions, I guess. There's experimental and then there's experiential
Mhm.
archaeology and history. So the archaeology side is taking artifacts and reconstructing them. And there's experimental, where you're trying different things to see what works.
Mhm.
To try and that's sort of more about the process of how you get to the end project. So how the experiments to get you to that piece of history or that piece of archaeology, and depending whether it's um, written history that you're recreating from scratch, where you don't have much artifacts, or in the archaeology using a piece that is actually existing and then trying to figure out what you do with it. That's more the archaeology side than the history side. Experimental is more about, once you have the product, what is it used for, as opposed to
Mhm.
how do you
Mhm.
get to recreate the thing that is there. So I would say that's the difference between the sort of the four phrases that are interconnected. But over the last 15 years or so, it's been a very popular new research methodology for a lot of people in a lot of fields of history, and a lot of locations and timeframes, to use uh, recreation as a means of understanding these things, whether that's, walking in the footsteps of people who've traveled to understand how logistics and geography and climate can play into armies on campaign, or
Mhm.
people living in different areas, or whether it's, recreating ancient clothes and wearing them, or weapons like I do. There's a different, obviously, so many different aspects you can use for it. And there's a lot of books that have been out recently talking about the benefits of experimental archaeology, or experiential history, depending which one you want to call it. So we got into it, or I got into it through Waldemar, because we have the Sarissas in terms of these. So Sarissa, for those of you who don't know, is a Macedonian pike, very long, I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but very long, sort of 18-foot long pike, basically, similar to the 17th century European ones that they used for a couple of hundred years after they were re-implemented. So we obviously, because they're made of wood, most of the ancient ones have not survived. We just have the metal ends, and we only had a few examples in a couple of tombs, and there was a join. I'll talk about this when we see the pictures, but there was a join and a couple and a big head and a butt spike, and we didn't really know what they were used for, in what context. Where they were discovered in the tomb without the wood joining it makes it difficult to tell, even if they would go together or if they just happened to be there. And we haven't found that many in battle sites either. So, and yet on the other side of the research, we have a lot of literature, comparatively anyway, in the ancient world, about how these Macedonian weapons were used and how they were so beneficial for these Macedonian armies of Philip II and Alexander the Great and his successors, and that their great achievements were supposedly based on this weapon. And yet we didn't really know much about how it was used. And we do have some training manuals that were written for the successors, or later, even into the Roman period, some even after the Sarissa has stopped being used, that describe how the unit, the phalanx that is called, that uses the Sarissa, functioned. But these don't necessarily tell you about the Sarissa itself. And there was even controversy about what even wood it was used to make, because of the different sources telling you different things, or misinterpretations. So we didn't know the size, we didn't know the shape of the blades or the butt spikes, the wood that it's made out of. So these are all questions that were coming up. The first project I did with Waldemar was, he was trying to use the recreation to prove a point that it made no sense for the phalanx to open at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's greatest battle, where our sources describe the phalanx opening and allowing these scythe chariots to drive through the middle. And a couple of the historians describe the carnage of legs being chopped off and all sorts of stuff. Whereas we were working together to argue that that made no sense. You could just put your pikes down and then the chariot would get stuck on the pikes. There's no need to actually open your channel to let the chariots through. Even if that's what the historians say, it's likely that they've got confused about what they're describing. And so our initial project in my PhD with Waldemar and another scholar, Carolyn Willikus, who does cavalry stuff, together, the three of us wrote an article arguing that the phalanx didn't open like the sources say, and that actually these sources are describing what happens when the chariots attack non-phalanx units like hoplites and so on, who don't have big spears to hide behind, basically. So that project was that. And then when I moved here, I wanted to go further into sort of really understanding the weapon more, having done a little bit in Calgary, where I did my grad school with Waldemar. I forgot to say that earlier. We had just wooden ones because we only needed the length and we didn't want to hurt the horses with sort of metal ends and stuff. When I got here, I wanted to address the other controversies that were around the weapon itself. So seeing if we can figure out why we have different sizes of blades and butt spike, or spear points, I should call them, and butt spikes. And if we could assess, how wide they were. We don't even know the actual diameter of the wood. We have the diameter of the metal, but was it tapered? Was it not tapered? And then what type of wood was in it? So I created this project twofold to test hypotheses and build different sizes of weapons based on all the descriptions in the ancient sources and the images in the ancient sources, both shorter and longer, made of different sizes of spear point and butt spike types, and different woods. So that was the first half. And then the second half was, once we built them, was then to test what is described in these training manuals to see if they are real or if they're entirely fictional, basically. A lot of scholars argued that these training manuals were written by philosophers for an intellectual exercise, and they didn't hold any practical historical usefulness. And so I was of the opinion that they were historically useful, and that they did represent reality, partly because these same manuals were then used by the 17th century pike forces when they re-implemented it in Europe 1,000 years later, well, almost 2,000 years later. They used it because of these same sources that they still had access to, Aelian and Asclepiodotus. So I didn't see why it would work one way, but historians claimed it didn't work the other way. So I wanted to, once I'd built them and tested those things to see how they functioned, and how easy it was to train people to march around with them, how heavy they were, how easy it is. And then another part was my ongoing dispute with Polybius, who argues that the Macedonian Sarissa phalanx was inherently worse than the Roman legion because they had a Sarissa, and that the Sarissa itself was the problem as to why the Romans were able to defeat the Macedonian style armies easily. And I was of the opinion, and still am, that that's not the case, and that actually it was the generals who were the problem and the lack of
Yeah.
experience with the weapon rather than the weapon itself. The weapon itself did not hinder them as much against the sword wielding Romans as modern historians like to claim. So those were sort of the three aims of the project, to try and
By the way,
address
tell
those
them who
insights.
Polybius is. He's one I actually haven't talked very much about
Oh yeah,
because he's
Polybius
little.
is a fascinating historian. I'm publishing two collected books of essays on Polybius right now, sort of my latest thing. But Polybius was a Greek who went to live within Rome and serve the Romans during the last war, the Third Macedonian War, when the Romans conquered the last Macedonian kings, Perseus, and he was an advisor of the Achaean League who joined the Romans and therefore advised the Romans against the Macedonians. And he's an infamous historian for writing one of our most important pieces of surviving historical texts about this whole period of the rise of Rome and the especially the conquest of the Mediterranean by the Romans, both against Carthage in the west and the Macedonians and Seleucids in the east. And although his history is fragmentary, he has a lot of it is left, and there's this one key section where he talks about why the Macedonian phalanx is terrible and the Roman legion is the best. He also famous for his political distinctions, as to why the Roman Republic system is the best. That, interestingly enough, was one of the main texts used by the U.S. founding fathers when they created the U.S. Constitution. They based a lot of it on Polybius. So Polybius and his vitriol against the phalanx was another thing that spurred me as a phalanx defender to try and
Yeah.
get to the
They didn't
grips with
have
that.
enough
So
horse either.
yeah, exactly. So I wanted to, once I had a group, to see how easy it was, how conceivable it was to march up hills like Polybius says you can't, or to march over rivers like Polybius says you can't, or through woods and all these other different things that he describes as being impossible for a phalanx to do. Um, and so that was part of the experiment too. I finally finished it after my 10 years of product creation and getting out, and I have a whole thousands of pictures and videos of different people over the years experimenting with these sarissas. So I can share my screen now, unless you have another question
Nope,
beforehand.
nope, nope. Let's go show people what these things look like.
Okay. Whoops. Slideshow from the beginning. Hopefully you can see that from the beginning. Hopefully.
Okay.
Um, so here we are. This is after we finished. So I had to create a class, an experimental history class for my undergraduates to build these things. I got a grant of about $6,000 from the university as my research sort of startup grant to build. The plan was to build 64 of them, so I could get 2 units of 32, but I ended up only getting enough money for 48. So um, we built 48 of them, and we tried to build them half and half. And so I ended up needing not one, not two, but three classes to finish them off. The first class, we were a little over ambitious and we didn't even get half of them built because we had to get, even though we used pre-circled dowels, so wooden dowels that were 8 feet long. We still had to use the lathe and other things to size them correctly to fit into the metal. And then we actually, if I go to the next one of the next pictures, you can see them close up. So here you can see the ends of them. They're sort of metal tubes, and then we welded sort of a cross shape on the end to make the spear point because we discovered, despite my initial goal was to use a forge, it took way too long to forge when you don't have lots. So we had to figure out how to make them, and it was sort of a collective project with the first class. So we ended up with a team preparing the wood and a team cutting the metal tubes that we bought, the steel tubes, to save time on that too, to the right lengths that were matching to the archaeology. And then we had another team cutting the flat steel to make the points. Another team welding everything together. And then the butt spikes, you can just see one here. We had a long and conical version, which involved heating up and then bending a sheet of metal. So people had to stick that into the one forge we did have to heat it up and then hammer it into a circle, and then weld it closed together. And then we had, I need to find the images of the, whoops, that's our video. I might have to go find, apparently I don't have any pictures of my large size ones on here. Let me just stop share for now. Something was bound to go wrong, wasn't it? And then I'll see if I can dig out the pictures of the other ones. But our big size Sarissas were a lot bigger. So we had to make different ones. No, that's not helpful. All my images are of people marching with them instead of the actual beginning point.
I do remember you talking about the coupling in between, and that you weren't sure how these things held together, and then it all of a sudden made sense when you were actually marching with them, and that it kind of bent and it used the weight of the wood to keep it stuck. And I remember trying to pull them apart when we were done. That was tough getting them out.
Yes, they
So,
they can be tough. Well, my computer's unhappy with me right now. Okay, this is the PowerPoint I should have been sharing. Sorry, wrong one. Let's try again. Uh, Here we go. So this is the earliest version. So here we have them standing in their lines again. And this one you can just see next to each other, the big versions versus the little spiked versions. But if we
mhm.
get down some pages, here we have Ryan Jones, so the original student of Waldemar in Calgary, with his version that he made. So this is based on the archaeology that came out of Philip II's tomb, where we had a big, wide spearhead. This is about 30 centimeters long, whatever that is as inches. And it's wide, so it's pretty big. It And then you can just see at the end, both in the top picture where he's holding, you have a butt spike that's got flanges on, pointed flanges halfway down, versus the conical one that you can see just above it. And next to it here we have the Issus mosaic, which is a mosaic in Rome that's not in Rome, in a Roman mosaic in Pompeii that shows supposedly the Battle of Issus with Alexander on the left fighting Darius in the middle on his chariot. And you can see all the Sarissas in the background. And so some other scholars, most notably Secunda and Devine, had sort of assumed this picture was to scale. They'd measured the blades, the spear points that you can see there, as far as the length of the spears, and determined that they don't match the archaeology in the tomb. So here we have the sizes. This is what I was going off for the recreation part of the project, where you have the large spearhead at the top that's 50 centimeters long, so half a meter, uh, whatever that is, 1.5 feet or something, pretty big. You have your butt spike that's only just a little bit shorter than the blade. And then you have this join, which, as you can see, is tapered in the middle. And so these three pieces were discovered in the tomb of Philip together without the wood connecting them. And so the archaeologist Andronicus decided that this was a Sarissa blade, butt spike, and nobody really knew what this thing was. And so Waldemar and Ryan argued it was a coupling joint for the Sarissa, so that instead of having a one long 15-foot long piece of wood, you could have two shorter pieces of wood that you then join together in the middle. And as you can see from the shape of all of them, the wood is tapered to keep it in the metal more easily. And that's where our study doesn't quite match the archaeology, because it was too difficult and complicated in terms of our time in the class to taper all 48 of our sarissas at both ends equally to get them into rather cobbled together pieces of metal that we created. And then on the alternate side, you see the other version that people have argued for Sarissa, where you have a really long but thin spear point with a conical butt spike. And so we decided to build an equal number of each to test what it's like, why you get these two differences. What is the difference between a flange butt spike and a conical butt spike and a wide blade versus a narrow blade? And these are a lot smaller than these ones, right, in terms of weight and length and height. So that's what we were attempting to put together. And so here we can see with the documentation of the processes of making it. So we have the sheets where we got the patterns for the big blades with some patterns for the small blades connected, and this conical pattern for the bending of the circular butt spikes. After they've been cut out and bent with pliers, you see them like this, and then they get welded together, hopefully that these long things turn into a circle with our forge. And so here they have using their metal press. Here we have my student Avery, who was in 2 of my 3 classes, actually. He was very helpful. Here he is cutting off the metal tube parts that we then attached to all the different sections, and our woodshop workers busy working away with the lathe and getting the wood the right length. And there you have one heating up on the burner, which was our very high, innovative way of heating up the metal when we didn't have a forge going on or a fire at all. So we used an
We need a
electric hob.
stove. We need a stove in the ancient world.
Yeah, exactly. So that was in our second class we moved. Well, actually, halfway through this class we moved. I found someone who had a workshop where they had a forge in their workshop. So we left this place that didn't have any of the things we needed other than a wood shop, and we went out to his farm, and it was much better for making all this stuff. David Engels, I'll give him his credit. He was a retired engineering professor who just happened to have a amazing workshop on his farm that we did stuff with. So here we have the welders welding all the ones together. Here you can see all the big ones that are being welded, where we made them with the tube with a sort of little mouth-like thing, and then we put the flat piece in and then welded them down to create the spear shape to try and match the original of Philip's tomb. And then more examples. This is our clamp where we're trying to use a hand lathe to get the wood so it can go inside the metal join tube to get it connected properly. And then we have our finished versions, right? So our finished big spear, the right length, hopefully anyway, with the large spear point, and then a flanged butt spike at the bottom too. So our first class pretty much prepared most of the wood, and we got most of the big ones made. And here you can see just how long these things are. It's the whole length of the workshop when you put the the middle points together. Um, and we have all our piles of dowels that we never managed to get to. These were the ones stacked up against my old garage. Again, showing you how tall they were, or are still. And then in our transportation truck, because we didn't have a wagon with oxen to take these things all over the place. And then these are the smaller blades. So you can see in contrast with the big blades, the difference in size between the smaller ones and the big ones. And these ones don't look as close to the original archaeology. We sort of, our technical expertise lacked a little bit when we got to this part. But they're sufficient in terms of weight and so on. And so then we got to the experimentation part at the end. And in this picture, actually in this video, this was our attempt with my elite unit of sort of 4, including me at the front there, but 8 students who were willing to practice for a little bit longer to then at the end of the day, the final exam for this class was to go out and play with the Sarissas in a field. And so the 8 who were feeling enthusiastic, we tried marching down a hill and over a little culvert sort of fake stream thing to show that you could actually do that. So hopefully you can see
There they go down.
this working. Yeah. And then we discovered from holding it, which they never say anywhere, that it's very easy to walk. You just twist your hips and then you just walk normally. As you can see, everybody's, well, they should be just walking normally. There's no need to do weird steps or anything. So actually it's quite easy to go up and down. Your terrain doesn't really affect anything. The hardest thing is staying in formation, staying together, especially when there's 16,000 of you like there were in these battles. But as you can see there, you know, you just walk, literally you put it on your hip with your arm across your chest and you just walk. So you can just take normal steps. People think you have to shuffle and all sorts of crazy stuff. And so here we were trying the drill from the tactical manuals and figuring out how you stand. This was another thing we had to test, whether you put them all down, standing right behind each other like this, or if you're staggered so that each person is out on a line, which actually means that your phalanx takes up way more space if you stagger as you're doing it. And whether you hold it up on your chest, because that's where early modern pikes are held, is up high on your chest level, or you hold it down around your waist, as you can see here for the front ranks, which seems to be the case for Macedonian pikes. So that was the first class and phase of the experiment. Then we went to the second phase. So the second class was to finish building them because we only got about 25 built the first time. The second class in 2020 was to try and finish them all, but of course that was interrupted by the pandemic in March, so we only got half a class, so we didn't finish them. And because I couldn't get back onto campus for 2 years, the university almost threw them all away because they didn't think anyone was using them. From the storage, I left them in the basement because I hadn't been into the office for 2 years. The maintenance people were like, well, nobody's used these in years, we'll just get rid of them. And thankfully I got there like the week before they were going to get rid of them. I was like, I need them for my class. Where did they go to? They were like, oh, they're in our get rid of shed all the way on the outside of campus. So we had to drive and pick them up. So thankfully we didn't have to start right from the beginning again. So that was good. But in this, so in the second class, we got them half built. And then I had to have a third class, which was only with 6 students, where thankfully we didn't take long to finish them all off. It was mostly just fixing some that had broken and finishing the smaller versions. And the reason of the importance of small unit command in creating a manageable and useful phalanx, that you break people down into groups of 6 or 8. Our tactical manuals talk about the base unit being 8 people. And so if you have, and in Arian, he talks about 16 with 4 extra soldiers on higher pay of the base unit of 16. So that would mean, you know, in your group of 8, you have 2 people who are experienced and then 6 newer recruits. So I was working on the theory from the early modern pike manuals. Gustavus Adolphus, the famous Swedish emperor who sort of perfected pike warfare in the early 1600s in the 30 Years' War, he brought in very quickly after he became king a regulation that each unit of 6 had to have one person who was taken away for a year and got paid training as a sergeant, basically, by the state. And then he would go back to his village and he would be in charge of training the other 6 in his little contingent, basically. And other countries copied Gustavus. So you end up with a lot of highly trained sergeants doing most of the training for the other troops. So in comparative history, which is another thing I do, I used that evidence from later pikes to assume that the similar thing is happening in Macedon, because you don't really know how Macedonians trained at all, let alone low-level peasants, basically.
Yeah.
And so in this system, I was testing that where we had my 6 students, we finished the building, and then we took 4 days at the end of the class, about 3 hours a day, just practicing with the Sarissas, with those 6 students. And then at the very end of class, we had 28 volunteers come out who were just members of the public. And these 6 students were then given a group of 5 volunteers to train as their unit. And they got an hour to teach their mini unit with all the drill of how to use the Sarissa. And then after an hour, we put everybody together to recreate our larger phalanx. So that's what you can see here in our depictions. We have the different groups training separately, right? They're with the sergeant standing off to the side, helping the new volunteers, as you can see here, of different ages, practicing holding it and lifting it and lowering it in your different positions and twisting and walking with it. All the basic drill, which we discovered is the most important part of the Sarissa, is, getting comfortable using it. Like with any weapon, obviously, you have to do your basic training. With a Sarissa, it's very easy to pick up and you're instantly able to fight in a phalanx. That's what's cool about it. You don't need that much training, especially in the back, to do stuff. To be effective, you have to learn how to stay together and not create gaps. And that's what Polybius talks about as being the downfall for the later Macedonian phalanx, that gaps appeared. Under Alexander, his phalanxes were fighting on all sorts of terrain in all sorts of conditions because they were experienced veterans who, they didn't worry about how you kill your enemy with your spear. They presumably just trained about marching on every type of terrain under all hardships and stayed in formation. That is the most important part of it. As we know from the early modern periods too, it was the same concepts they had there in their training systems. So here we have the different subunits practicing, and then we put them in different formations to practice, and we put 2 units together, and then we finally put all of the units together into a sort of mini phalanx of 24 marching around. And then we try marching, twisting your hips, and then just walking normally. Again, staying in formation. And as you're walking, making sure your Sarissa doesn't get too far down that you stab the ground in front of you, especially as you're going up a hill or over rough terrain. That's the bit that causes problems. And of our Calgary one, I have a wonderful video of Waldemar suffering when the person in front of him doesn't pay attention to where his Sarissa blade is going. And these ones are obviously actual metal blades as opposed to wooden. And we also learned that the butt spikes, the big butt spikes, the flanged ones, you're more worried about your neighbor's butt spike than you are about staying in formation, because the flanges appear exactly at your groin where you don't want them to appear. Whereas the conical ones, you don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. So that was something that only became apparent when we held these things and practiced with them, that actually the flange parts don't make any sense for use in a phalanx. People have argued that they would be shoved in the ground to defend against a horse. But if that's the case, why are they perfectly equidistant to each other? And so I argue that their main use is actually that you can stand it in the ground and the flanges allow it to be perfectly vertical, so that it can be a ceremonial sarissa that we know stood either side of a royal king's tent, or in this case, the royal king's tomb, and that you have your ceremonial sarissa standing up by the doorway. and you don't have to hold it because you've stubbed it in the ground and the flanges will keep it perfectly vertical. You don't want any slope whatsoever. To me, that's the only reason why you need four flanges. Because if you're stubbing it in the ground for a horse, the flanges get in the way of that too. You'd want them slightly sloped so that you could, get at the right angle for shoving it in the ground. Um, uh, so so we just have a few, whoops, this works. We have a marching towards the camera, which is always interesting to see. And again, you can see drifting apart is the thing that always happens so that's the training that you've got to get used to, avoiding your drift and staying close to the unit next to you. And so the other part of the class was inviting out an expert in the early modern pike. And here we have my colleague, Dr. Lucian Stiana Daniels, who writes on the pike in the 17th century. And he came to help train my 6 students. And we were discussing together the difference between training with early modern pikes versus Macedonian pikes. And the big difference is that Macedonian ones have butt spikes and early modern ones don't. So as you can see here, he's showing you the early modern stance where you hold it up, but you have your hand it should be over the back of the pike. But if you have a butt spike, you can't do that, right? And our sources tell us that the butt spike was there as a counterbalance, so you could hold it towards the end. So it's a different type of holding the weapon, which means they're built differently. The early modern one doesn't have a join. They're made out of full pieces of tree, which is more available in mainland Europe when you're not campaigning all the way over to India than the Macedonians, who would have to figure out how to replace a 15-foot spear if any of their sarissas broke, if they were marching over the Hindu Kush and into all these different areas, right? So that's our main argument as to why they were joined. So Lucian was here showing you how you can stand and brace for cavalry, where you don't need a butt spike, you brace it on your foot, and you have specific calls. And he was sharing the early modern call techniques and training techniques. He does reenactment in Germany, where they still have pike regiments reenacting 16th century German battles. So he is a veteran of those modern training pike regiments. And so he was implementing with the students those training aspects too. And we were discussing the different tactical manuals, ancient and modern, to see how we go. And so here we have the keen volunteers trying the overhand version and had shown how to carry it by Lucian, as well as the drag method, which I think I didn't put a picture on of that here as well. And so after this was sort of the culmination of the project. And then the final thing was to get 48 people out finally marching. And so I forced one of my undergraduate classes that had 60 people in it to get out one day. And with only 50 minutes of training, I got sort of 2 phalanxes of 24 marching against each other up a slight hill, with all mixes of ages and women and men together in different positions, different heights, all sorts of stuff to test whether physically you wanted a phalanx of all the same heights or whether it didn't actually make much difference depending on your size. But you, Jana, have held one of these and marched around
Yes,
in them too,
yes.
so
And what did you find? How much use was it? I remember when and the culmination of the Alexander conference, Graham brought these, and you had all of these old Macedonian specialists out running around with them. Some of us realizing these things are really heavy,
mhm.
especially if you're old like me. But and I'll come back to one other thing in a minute. But what did you find? Because you mentioned that you tested it with sizes and stuff, and then how much difference would you want to move people around? Like if Philip and then Alexander are arranging their phalanxes, who are they going to put where?
Yeah, so we discovered that yeah, once you're in the back 5 ranks, it's actually easier because you're just holding your Sarissa up in the air.
Hmm.
So the people who don't have the forearm strength to maneuver it very much, generally you can just
Like
put them at the
me.
back and they're safe. So that's
Yeah.
probably what happened in the ancient world, that they put the new recruits at the back, so you work your way
Interesting. Yeah.
forwards, basically.
Hmm.
Although the
Hmm.
very back rank is clearly a higher pay soldier to stop anyone running away, but everybody in between, you're stuck in there once you get in there, but you probably start number 15 out of 16 and then work your way forwards in experience, right? Only really the first three ranks are the ones who really have to know what they're doing. And in the unit described by Arian, that's exactly what he says. The first three ranks are on extra pay, and the
Hmm.
back rank is on extra pay, and the other ones are all the same because they're the ones who are doing the fighting and the killing. The others are just there to make up the numbers.
Hmm.
Even if the front ranks die, by the time the battle is done, you haven't had time for rank number six to get to the front row to take up the position and fight, right? So,
Yeah.
actually, in most battles, your best troops are your first three ranks, and they're the most important. And they're the ones who set the pace. They're the ones who set the positioning. They're everybody else, because of the way that you're sort of in this lattice work of pikes, you don't have any choice but to follow the person in front of you because their butt spike is keeping you in place. So as long as the first three ranks know how to march and stay together, the other ones have to follow, right? Otherwise, it gets out of whack. So we discovered the same thing that you put your most experienced people at the front. We were also putting our shortest people at the front, um, which in hindsight, because then they didn't have to worry about keeping up with other people's steps and things, or not being able to see from people taller than them. But actually, in hindsight, it might be easier to have the shorter people at the back, so they just have to worry about keeping their Sarissa up in the air, and they don't have to worry about levels. So you do sort of want people to be able to hold their arms at the same distance down, so that you
Hmm.
can create your lattice work of sarissas to protect you on your right hand side. A big issue was a couple of students who were either left-handed or dyslexic tried to hold it on different sides, and
Yes,
that threw the
tell the
whole
funny
sarissa
story
off.
about Ed. That was the one I was going to say. That's exactly the sort of thing you only learn when you're in actually doing this stuff.
Yeah, so I have this student right here, Zach, who's done all my classes. He's just graduating this year and going off to grad school in uh, where's he going? Newfoundland somewhere, Memorial University for classics. But he is dyslexic. He's right-handed but dyslexic, but he does everything on the other side. So when we were doing hoplites, he wanted to put his hoplite shield on his right hand and use his sword in his left hand. And when he picked up his sarissa, he dropped it on his left hand side, and everybody else had it on their right hand side, and he wanted to walk left foot first instead of right foot first. And Ed Anson was the same. He's dyslexic, and so he naturally wanted to stand the opposite. So when I was trying to get everybody to take the formation, I had to yell at Ed to get in the right place multiple times because he wasn't grasping that
Yeah.
it was on the wrong side and that everybody had to be on the same side.
And you know that that sort of thing had to have been present in these ancient phalanxes as well. So that would have been a learning process for them of getting it's the sort of stuff that never even occurred to me
Yeah,
until
exactly.
that thing. So this is again the sort of value that I think experimental archaeology can really bring.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, we got a lot of conclusions out that we wouldn't have got otherwise, right? In the tactical manuals, for example, there's one turn that says do a three-quarter turn. And it never occurred to me until we actually tried it that actually you if you have your Sarissa up in the air, you don't need to do a three-quarter turn because you can just turn a quarter the other direction. You don't need a three-quarter turn to the right. You can just do a quarter turn to the left and you end up in exactly the same place. But what you can't do is a quarter turn to the left when your Sarissa is down because you'll whack everybody in your way, right? So the whole unit has to turn to the right
Right.
and you have to turn three quarters. If you want to face that way, you've got to go all the way around this way.
To do it.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I didn't understand what that term meant until we actually tried it, right? And the same with the butt spike thing I was saying, that didn't pay attention until you actually get in a phalanx. And the weights are different. You were mentioning the sizes and the heaviness.
Hmm.
The smaller blades and smaller conical butt spikes are noticeably
Hmm.
lighter than the
I
bigger
did notice
ones.
that.
Also, the few that we have actually tapered wood are significantly lighter than most of these, which weren't tapered. So that's a big difference too. And the length is a big difference. We have some really long ones that are actually narrower in diameter, but
Mhm.
longer, because to try and test up to the 24 feet that they say some of the
Right.
Hellenistic phalanxes were. And they're really light. Even just a quarter-inch diameter makes a huge weight difference on the Sarissas. So they're not tapered, but they're the width that a tapered one would have been. They just go straight into the metal butt spike instead of being wider and then tapered to fit into the tube. They're the width, the diameter of the inside of the tube, and they're really long. But then they really get affected by the wind, and they're so long that when you put them up, you feel like it's going to pull you over.
Interesting. Yeah,
But
yeah.
when you put them
The,
down, they're lighter, and so they're more easy to maneuver because they're down. You don't get the same wind problems, and you can maneuver them just as easily as the big ones because the big ones are heavier. They don't blow as fast, so you've got to blow as much. I
Mhm.
mean, in the wind, so you've got to get the happy medium between length and diameter and size of wood. We also tried different woods between ash and cherry, which is what they talk about in the ancient sources. And cherry, because of it's a denser wood, feels lighter than ash, even though it weighs the same. It feels
Interesting. Yeah.
nicer. So the one I keep in my office is our nice little cherry wood one. But
Jerry.
cherry
Yeah.
wood was a lot more expensive than ash. So most of them are all ash. And our hemlock ones that somebody else argued for were not good. Although they were really light, they warp in weather very easily. So all the ones that have bent were the hemlock ones. They're really out of shape, even after just a couple of years, which is partly to do with South Dakotan weather, which is crazy.
Which they would have dealt with, but yeah.
Yes,
But you don't know what it
definitely.
would have been like in other places in Asia.
Yeah,
One thing, because we're getting toward the end of time, and
yeah,
you've mentioned them several times, and I did want you to talk a bit about the training manuals. That is your other area of research before we end, and just to tell folks what these things are. Many readers who are interested in
yeah.
Alexander, they know who
Hopefully you can
Arian
still hear
is,
me.
Curtius, but not these.
Yeah, good. So the tactical manuals were well, there were a whole series of tactical manuals. There's only a few that survive, and one of the surviving ones gives a list of previous authors who wrote manuals on warfare. And it seems like the earliest author listed is Pyrrhus, the nephew of Alexander the Great, who apparently wrote a tactical manual that didn't survive, as did one of his better generals, Cineas. Uh, so that seems to have been the first tactical manual. But in the fourth century of Greece, it became common practice for soldiers to write instruction manuals. So we have Xenophon's cavalry commander, we have on horsemanship, we have Aeneas Tacticus writing a manual on siege warfare. And then there's all sorts of other ones that have survived. Most of the ones on sieges, incidentally, have survived, or siege weapons and catapults and things, but not many on actual armies. And so there are three that survive that describe Macedonian armies. The problem is the earliest of the surviving ones is Asclepiodotus, who seems to have been writing in around 90-ish BC. So well after Rome has sort of mostly defeated the Seleucids and the Egyptians and all these other Macedonian kingdoms. And they've started using Roman arms instead of the phalanx. And he is a philosopher. He was head of I think he was head. Anyway, he was a key philosopher at Rhodes, alongside some of the other Stoic philosophers. Posidonius, a famous Roman philosopher, also wrote a tactical manual. But he was from the Seleucid kingdom, apparently, and he wrote a tactical manual based on the Macedonian style army, where the first section deals with the phalanx, the sarissas. It talks about the names for command positions, where they were, what the size of units were, all that type of stuff. And it gives commands like the orders, the types of marching that you do, counter marches to change your frontage, the formations that you could draw up, all sorts of stuff. And it includes diagrams. But we didn't really know what he was talking about. And a lot of scholars have argued that because he's a philosopher, it's philosophy. It's not actual military that he's writing. Polybius wrote a tactical manual that's lost. As a military, he was a general before he was a historian, and so had that survived, presumably people would have been like, okay, this is a military manual by a soldier, same as if Pyrrhus's had survived
Mhm.
or Cnaeus's. But because the only ones that survived were written by a philosopher, scholars have discounted the manual as being reliable, even though it's based on this whole series of other ones that are now lost to us. And then the two later ones, written by Arrian, the same Arrian, the historian of Alexander, who was a Roman general 200 years later, in 130, I think, is his time frame. And then we have Aelian,
Mhm.
Aelianus, who also wrote a tactical manual, which he dedicates to the Emperor Trajan, I think. They're both Roman officers. They're writing in Greek for Greeks, but they're in the Roman army long after the phalanx has ever been in use or even considered. And so they're writing a manual because it's part of their historical requirements for good philosophers and historians to write a manual, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they write one the same way that all these other philosophers for centuries have been writing manuals. And so they're recording what is in other earlier ones that no longer exist, it seems. But they're difficult to argue that those have historical connections because they're so late. I argue that Sclepiodotus is historical because it's still writing under the period when the Seleucids had an actual army that he could have observed. And he's a rival to Posidonius, who was also a Seleucid philosopher and who apparently fought in Seleucid armies. So that gives some level of practical connection to it. And both of them refer to Polybius, who was also in Macedonian style armies and writes about them. So I argue, Mike, I came to this in my PhD trying to prove that they are useful. And there's still me and a few others who argue they are, and a whole bunch of others who argue they aren't. It hasn't been confirmed yet either way. Um, uh,
And given academics, it probably never will be because we will continually argue about these things.
yeah, exactly.
Um, I will say that in the notes for the episode, I will be putting some of Dr. Wrightson's CV. Well, we don't have the CV, but at least some of the books. And
I'll send you my CV. You can share
oh
it.
yeah, I know, but we need to put it online. Otherwise, I can't put the whole thing in the notes, is why.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true.
So
Mhm.
otherwise the notes would go on forever. So we will,
Yeah,
you have a lot of things published, Graham. So
yeah, that is true.
so maybe pick out a couple and I'll make sure those are in the notes if
Yeah.
folks want to go there and look at things. Um all right, I think that's it. Just a
Yeah, the only other thing I
reminder.
wanted to say was
Oh
that
yes, go ahead.
we one thing that's come out of this is now I'm writing about the how you command a phalanx. The small unit
Mm,
organization of the phalanx is more important than the large organization of a phalanx, and how many in blocks you needed. And so I do, as I said, a lot of comparison with the medieval and early modern
mhm.
pike phalanxes and sharing information. And so I'm currently examining my main book was on combined arms and how you need to
Yes.
phalanx doesn't work by itself. It needs cavalry and light infantry in conjunction all fighting together. As part of that, I'm now examining the importance of sergeants and so on as a result of this project in terms of how important they are to units and what they bring to a unit itself, especially when it comes to the phalanx, but others too, from that aspect. That's another thing that is mentioned in the manuals, but nobody really trusts the commands, the names of officers that are given in those places. So that's another area that is forthcoming of this project, I guess, as we go through.
That's where you're going to go next with
Yeah.
it. Then
Hmm.
yes, okay. All right. So as I said, if you have stumbled over this and are not already, subscribe to the channel, please do so. And there will be more folks forthcoming. I'm going to have on Sabina Mueller, will be our next guest person. She's going to talk about Perdiccas, her book. is in German. So if you're an Anglophone and it's I can't read the German, then she'll be here to talk about Perdiccas and why he may be the most underestimated Argead king of all time in terms of his specialization. And once more, I'll have material on some of what Dr. Wrightson's been talking about in the notes for the episode. So we will see you next time with a different topic.
Farewell.